Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Good morning. My name is Cindy Stewart. I am the operations manager for Cadre and your instructor for today. I am joined by our executive director, Marsha Hovey, and my training partner, Luna Muhammad. First, I want to talk just a little bit about who Cadre is. Most of you probably already know Cadre and have been working with us for many years. However, there could be some of you that have been here that are here for the first time and don't know about Cadre. Cadre is a nonprofit organization. We came to be in as a result of the Loma Prieta earthquake in 1989. However, we did not become a nonprofit until 2019, just a few months before COVID hit. What a horrible time to do that, but that's the way that goes. We're comprised of, our leadership team is comprised of primarily emergency managers. Some of us are retired. I personally am retired and living in Vancouver, Washington. Some of us are retired and some of us are still working in emergency management. A couple of years ago, the Board of Supervisors deemed us the voluntary organization active in disasters. That means that we are part of a national network of nonprofits that bring recovery to an area. If you would like to know a little bit more about Cadre, our website is cadresv.org. But the primary mission of Cadre is to strengthen our coordination for disaster response and recovery, primarily, for the whole community of Santa Clara County through partnerships, planning, and training. Now, let's talk about continuity of operations planning, because that's what you're here for, right? First of all, I want to talk a little bit about the objectives of today's session. We're going to define continuity of operations. Most of you have already heard what continuity of operations is potentially, but we need to go over it just in case and just to make sure that we're all on the same page. So we'll talk about some of the key elements of continuity of operations planning. We'll also explain the criteria, the critical role of the specific parts of continuity of operations plans, which are delegation of authority and orders of succession. Those are the two elements that we're going to talk primarily about today, and we'll discuss how and when to use those elements. Okay? So, continuity of operations, as defined by FEMA, the continuity of operations planning is an effort within an organization to ensure that essential functions, big bold print, continue to be performed during a wide range of emergencies. Essential functions are the core of continuity of operations planning. Continuity of operations planning is based around what are those things that your agency absolutely needs to get done in a disaster. What are the things that you need to do no matter what? They could be feed your clients if you're a food bank or an agency like that. They could be take care of the elderly. They could be make your payroll to make sure that your employees are still able to come to work in a disaster or that sort of thing. So essential functions are very personal to you, to your agency, but they could be there are potentially some crossovers, like make sure that your bills are paid, or make sure that you're picking up the checks for your revenue, that sort of thing. So I can't tell you what your essential functions are, but what I could do is I could walk you through an exercise to help you and your management team figure out what you deem your essential functions. But I want to talk a little bit about using the continuity of operations plan. And one of the real concepts that I want to share with you about that is that this is not your emergency response plan. Your emergency response plan can be activated without your COOP being activated, and vice versa. Your COOP plan is a temporary plan, a short-term plan that helps you bridge the gap or keep the boat afloat, if you will, from the picture on the screen. From the time bang happens, whatever bang is, getting your essential functions back up and running within that first 12 hours, and then being able to keep those essential functions up and running for a duration, whatever it takes for your other team, your management team, or whoever is involved in recovery to help your agency figure out how to get a new building, get your communications back up and running, get access to the internet again, whatever the issue might be. So they respond with the emergency response plan You respond with your continuity of operations plan, and you're focused on your essential functions and keeping those essential functions up and running until they can get you in a more permanent place. Okay? Anybody have any questions thus far? All right, seeing none, we're plowing through this pretty quickly. When to activate your COOP plan. So like I said before, your COOP plan is not necessarily activated just because your emergency response plan is activated, and vice versa. You may not use your COOP plan when your emergency response plan is activated. It could be activated in any circumstance that causes it to be impossible for employees to get their work done in a regular way. The slide says in a regular facility, but it's more than just in their regular facility, and we all know that from COVID because many of us work from home now. So it's in the regular way that you would get your work done. If it's impossible for that to happen, it could be something very small, like a few years ago, the county exec's office, there on Heading, had a construction team outside of the building, and they hit the power line underground as they were digging and brought the entire building's power down. They knew that it was going to take a while for that to get back up and running. So they had a very short, very focused disaster on one building, and they knew what the time frame was. It was going to be 3 days. They activated their continuity of operations plan, and the agencies that needed to be located maybe together, like the county exec's office and county council, they came over to the emergency operations center, which is where I was working at the time, and resumed their essential functions. They didn't bring their whole team. They only brought those people that were critical to resuming their essential functions for those 3 days. They let everyone else go home so that they could vacate the building completely. But they had 3 days that they had to find someplace else to get their work done. They still had to do the work. They still had to keep those essential functions up and running. But the infrastructure, the rest of the infrastructure of the county was still available. There was still communications and all of those kind of things. So it wasn't a situation where there was a big disaster like a regional flood or a big fire or an earthquake that causes multiple fires. It was just a single event. But you can activate a COOP under either of those circumstances or anything in between those circumstances. There are elements of a COOP, and delegation of authority is one of them, that you can activate just that delegation of authority element if, say, your office manager is going on vacation for 2 weeks, or going on maternity leave for 6 or 10 weeks, and some of their job needs to be farmed out to other people. You can use your continuity of operations plan, and especially the delegation of authority part of it, because the people in the plan that are part of that delegation of authority are already trained to do those tasks. So that's an opportunity to activate that element of your plan, even if there isn't a disaster. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along. All right. So the continuity of operations plan is broken essentially into 10 elements. And I like to think about it like a three-legged stool. The first being the platform of the stool, or the basis of the whole plan, if you will. The reason that we have a three-legged stool is that platform, those essential functions, those things that you have to get done no matter what. And we talked a little bit about examples of what some of those things might be. It could be that you have a client base, that you're a food bank and you need to do feeding. It could be that people are depending on you, that clients are depending on you for their livelihood. So those are essential functions that you need to keep doing, even if your building has caught fire, even if there's a flood and the roads are not available, even if you don't have the people in place to be able to do those things. You'll find that if, as you go through the process of essential functions, that I find that my experience is, I find that many agencies want to write a big long list of essential functions because it makes them feel like they're very valued and they're very important. And essential functions and the importance of your company don't have anything to do with each other, really. Essential functions are not the pet project that your executive director has this year. Essential functions are not necessarily what is being funded by the grant. They could be, but they are not necessarily. So you need to take a look at every single function that your agency does, all the departments and all of the functions that they do. And that's how we start with essential functions, with determining essential functions, is write down everything. And then we'll eliminate those things that we don't have to keep up and running for that first short little period. Keeping in mind that continuity of operations planning is a shorter duration. So maybe it's something that seems critically important to you. There's an annual report that you have to get out in order to get funded for next year. If you're not close to the time of that report being done, it might be critically essential, but is it critically essential in the next 30 days? So there are things like that that you need to take into consideration. But everything else in the continuity of operations plan is based on whether or not we can get those essential functions accomplished and how we might be able to do that in a disaster of whatever kind. So the first leg of the stool talks about who's going to do those essential functions. So that's where we look at delegation of authority, where we look at orders of succession, and where we look at our human capital management. That's where cross-training is. That's where assigning those tasks to an individual are. That's where we figure out who's going to be in charge if the boss is not available, and who is capable of keeping those essential functions up and running, the who of the essential functions. The second leg is resources, and we talk about things like our building. Do we need a secondary building to perform our tasks in? What about our communications? And that's not what you say, but what you use to say it with. Our communication systems up and running? And if they're not, what is our contingency for communicating? And then where are we storing our vital records? Do we have a backup plan? Can we get access to them from another facility, from working from home, or from an out of area location? So those are the resources. And then the procedures are devolution. What happens if our agency is so damaged by the disaster that we can't even do our essential functions? We need to have a contingency plan that helps us to recognize who would do this if we didn't do it. If our agency wasn't doing this, who could keep this afloat? Who else could care for those seniors or feed those people if our food bank wasn't open? And then, we're going to tear it all down with a continuity of operations plan in the beginning and think only about the essential functions. We're not going to do anything else other than just those essential functions. And we're only going to have that team that can do those essential functions available. So that means that our organization really shrinks down, could shrink down to only a couple of people, right? And when the disaster is over, we need to figure out how to smoothly get from only a couple of people doing only essential functions back to a full team doing the full work that our agency does. So we need to be able to reconstitute our organization to get back to normal, or to get to a new normal, if that might be the case. So that it's almost an undoing of the breakdown of the essential functions and bringing it all back to a full-fledged organization. And then, of course, there isn't anything that isn't enhanced by testing it, training it, and exercising it. And I'm a huge advocate for doing those things every opportunity that you get. If you see on the news that there has been a like agency to yours that has been affected by a disaster, use it as an opportunity to bring your team together and say, what if this happened to us? How would we respond? What would we do different than they did? Or what would we do the same? Or what did we learn from what happened to them? There are hundreds and hundreds of experiences that you can just Google and find on the internet of agencies that have been through disasters, that have written after action reports and are willing to share those with you. And you can use those as an opportunity to create your own little exercise. Just a staff meeting. Okay, let's just say there's a fire in this building today. I know evacuation is one of the things on our list. That's our response plan. But what are we going to do about making sure that we keep these essential functions afloat? Do we have a binder that has a list of who all is trained to be able to do those essential functions that we need to get out when we do our evacuation? Those kind of questions can be asked during an exercise, and during a training, that cross training of staff, that ability to recognize there's a binder with people's names and who's trained on what, and it sits at the station at the front door. Somebody needs to grab it. Who's going to grab it? That, just those things are more important than the document that's actually written on the piece of paper. The exercise of going through a training or an exercise or a discussion about what would we do if is essentially important to keeping your agency up and running and sustainable during a disaster and keeping those essential functions going for you. So let's talk a little bit deeper about the delegation of authority and the orders of succession. I left human capital management on this page because it is the third element of this leg of the stool, but we're not going to talk so much about it other than, managing the staff that are performing those essential functions is what delegation of authority and orders of succession are. And we'll talk a little bit more about what the difference is between delegation of authority and orders of succession. They may seem very similar to some, but there are some differences. But delegation of authority is delegating the tasks, that the authority of those tasks to another individual, and it's usually the management or decision-making team that needs to consider the delegation of authority. So who can approve purchases in a disaster when a disaster happens and we activate our continuity of operations plan? On a day-to-day basis, maybe every purchase, every resource purchase needs to be approved by the director. But the director might say, once the COOP is activated, I give this person and this person the authority to sign for resources because I'm going to be busy doing other stuff, recovering or responding to this disaster or recovering from this disaster, focused on finding us another building or whatever. So breaking it down kind of by task or maybe a group of tasks and delegating that group of tasks to an individual or a group of individuals. Orders of succession is a little bit different in that it is more the whole individual's responsibilities, the responsibilities of the executive director as the executive director. You could activate the COOP plan, use your delegation of authority, and delegate some of the executive director's tasks to certain people who are trained to do those things, and then the rest of the executive director's responsibilities to the deputy director, for example, because the executive director is not in place. So we'll talk a little bit more about that because that's what we're talking about today, is those two elements, but just briefly, that's kind of the differences between the two. The importance of a delegation of authority, and I guess this is probably a no-brainer, but let's talk about it anyway. Some of the purpose or some of the benefits of having a delegation of authority is that we ensure that there's no interruption in decision making, and decision making during a disaster is critical, of course. We had a smooth transition from, and maybe even a shadow situation where the executive director delegates authority to someone else and someone else shadows them so that they've got a backup. And we keep all of that information clear and up to date as possible. It clarifies who's in charge so that human capital management piece of this leg of the stool knows who to turn to if they've got questions or who to take direction from, because this department the tasks of this department have been delegated to this particular person. It also provides some clear lines of authority so that there's no confusion and no inefficiency, and especially no redundancy. There's little worse than having redundant efforts wasted in a disaster because multiple people are trying to do the same thing, thinking that that's what needs to be done, and so we waste efforts. So making sure that those lines are clear and clean, and that'll reduce confusion. When can we trigger a delegation of authority? And, I talked a little bit about that earlier, but let's dig into it a little bit more. Of course, we can do it during an emergency or during when we've activated our continuity of operations plan, but we could do it anytime. Let's just say that the executive director is having a surgery and is going to be out for 6 weeks, and some of the tasks that they do on a regular basis or would need to do in the next 6 weeks need to be delegated to someone else. Well, what better place to go than to the delegation of authority in the continuity of operations plan to see who is already trained to do those tasks, who can actually seamlessly pick that responsibility up and take care of it for the next 6 weeks. So it isn't just in an emergency, but in planned absences, we can use the key personnel that have been trained to pick up the responsibilities of a delegation of authority to take over those tasks in a disaster. I mean, not in a non-disaster way. All right, so our delegation of authority plan needs to be very clear. And it's, when I talk about continuity of operations planning as a whole, as the basic plan itself, I skim over the delegation of authority and the orders of succession a little bit, because getting a plan in place is a stepped process, and having something in place is better than having nothing in place. But if we're really going to do all the work that needs to be done in a continuity of operations plan, we're going to dig deep into that delegation of authority, because it's so critical to the success of whether or not we keep those essential functions running smoothly and we have that smooth transition. And some of that has to do with having some clearly defined parameters for those tasks to ensure that nobody's got any questions about who makes the decision of this. It's not necessarily the manager that has the most seniority or the loudest voice or the biggest personality. It's not necessarily that person. It's the person that the executive director or the top management team has deemed appropriate to take on those tasks. And it needs to be documented clearly in your continuity of operations plan, going through every, again, like I said about essential functions, you start by writing down everything that each department does, and then you eliminate those things that are not essential. In this case, that's true too, but do it at a deeper level. Look at what the executive director does. What does the executive director do? What are they responsible for? Let's look at everything they do, and then let's take all of those things and decide which ones are essential, which ones are important enough to do a delegation of authority. And it might be a little bit bigger than just the delegation of authority for a disaster. It might be that day-to-day delegation as well. What tasks does that executive director do that we need to give to somebody else, that we can be assured that that person will seamlessly keep that task going, or will seamlessly create that report or do whatever that task is? So if it's documented, there are two things that can happen. There's the ability for the person that's taking over that task to look at the documentation and say, this is what I'm supposed to do. These are my tasks. I don't do these things day to day, but I've been trained to do them in the absence of the executive director. And so therefore, these are the tasks that I'm taking on. And I've been trained on how to take care of each one of these tasks. I know where the files are that this information is kept in. I know what the process is. I know what the thought process is of the executive director as they do these tasks. And so therefore, I can pick up and take on this responsibility, this task's responsibility, seamlessly without any interruption. Pre-authorizing those tasks is crucial. Making sure that everyone is informed, all of your team is informed on what those tasks are and who is going to do them is critical. Not everyone needs to know exactly how that person is going to do those tasks. That person needs to know how they're going to do those tasks and needs to have some time with that executive director to, pick their brain, to see how they do it, to watch the process happen, to be involved in exercises or in times when that task is being done by the executive director, so that they can have that ability to keep that going. They need to be empowered and be given the responsibility to act quickly, to actually activate that task and take over that task quickly as soon as that plan is activated, or as soon as that delegation is made. They know exactly what they have to do. They know exactly what materials they need to do it with. They know exactly what files they need to have, what software they need to have, what system they need to use. They have all of that information available to them in advance, so that they can then pick up those responsibilities. And everyone that reports to that person needs to know who new to report to. Who do I turn to if you're not available? Does that person have all the information that I'm going to need, all of the answers to the questions that I'm going to need to ask while the executive director is out? I keep saying executive director because that's probably the most universal use of a delegation of authority, or of orders of succession also. So, substitute the word executive director for whatever your leadership person is that you're thinking about, as we talk a little bit more about this. And then, I can't stress it enough, and I'll say it again: practice, 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 practice. Give everyone the ability to recognize that person that's taking over those tasks is equipped and is ready, including that person. Give them the confidence to be able to take that task on. Don't just drop this thing on them when the disaster happens and say, okay, sink or swim. Make sure that they're trained and that they know exactly how to do that. And the way you do that is by practicing. So we've talked a little bit about what kind of authority and empowering them to do that. And then there's also kind of the other side of the coin, making sure that they stay within the boundaries of their authority, that they don't decide, oh, okay, well, I have the ability to sign the checks to purchase resources, so I'm going to go buy us, our whole department, all new laptops. I'm going to use this opportunity to fulfill some other little thing that I think that management should be doing and they're not doing. Creating those clear boundaries and limitations. You can do this within this parameter. You can purchase new equipment if the old equipment has been damaged in the disaster, but you can't go out and buy us all brand new printers. You can't go out and purchase a new fleet vehicle because you want to drive around in a new car. Those kind of parameters, those limits. And they're limits for a couple of reasons. There are limits for the fact that they set expectations and everyone knows, and again, everybody needs to know what those limitations are as well. So don't go ask that person that's been delegated the task of purchasing resources to buy you a new laptop because your boss wouldn't. Make sure that everyone knows what those limitations are so that you set those expectations for everyone. But then it's also a mechanism for accountability. It also gives that person the ability to, if something goes wrong, that person is the one that's accountable for making those decisions, and it gives them those parameters. I wasn't the one that purchased the extra laptops. I didn't have that authority. I am only accountable to this particular task. So it keeps those limitations realistic and allows the executive director to go away and have that surgery or whatever, and know that their tasks are being managed the same way that they would manage them, and within the parameters of what they would manage them. Okay. Communication, and we've talked a little bit about this, and I've stressed it in almost every slide I've talked about so far, but making sure that everyone inside the organization knows who has the authority to do those tasks that, if need be, need to be delegated. So all of your stakeholders need to know that. All of your employees need to know that. All of your clients need to know that. All of your volunteers might need to know that. Anyone that's internal to your organization needs to know what the delegations are, especially if they're going to be affected by those delegations. So your volunteers may not be affected by the delegation. The delegation may not have anything to do with your volunteers, so maybe you don't need to tell them. But if they have questions, they need to know who they're supposed to turn to if you've delegated that authority. And then your external communication too, making sure that the public knows who's in charge or who they should turn to or who the media should look to if there's a news report that needs to be done or a press release that needs to be created, who's supposed to sign off on that, who your partners need to look to. Your agency has been affected by this disaster and you're a food bank, and there's another food bank that needs to know who they need to communicate with. Who should they contact if you're not there to see whether or not they can help, to see whether or not you have resources, all of that sort of thing. Any other agencies that you may be working with, a transition agency or another agency that maybe does something different. Others that might be in your same building or in your same location need to know who the boss is, or who is in charge of making these particular decisions, so that we have some smooth coordination as we transition from normal day-to-day, bang happened, now what do we do phase. Keeping that, communications is always the downfall of every disaster. And so thinking through those communications in advance and writing that down in your continuity of operations plan, and especially as it pertains to the delegation of authority piece of your plan, making sure that you write down who needs to know this information. And then, maybe it's layers of delegates. Maybe it's multiple people that need to be delegated that authority. Wouldn't it be awful if the executive director was not available and the disaster struck and they had delegated authority to this person to take on these critical tasks and make these critical decisions, and this person was impacted by the disaster. So we needed that person also. So this person and that person, making sure that we've got multiple layers of delegation so that we can, if, maybe it's not even that they're not available. Maybe this person is overwhelmed. They've got their own set of tasks. We didn't think about how overwhelmed they were going to be. They're going to need to push some of their stuff off on someone else. Can they take that delegation of authority off your hands? Can someone else do this particular piece? Is someone else trained to do this particular piece? So cross-training, of course, is important. Making sure it's a key. I will always say to you, cross-train your staff. Make sure that everyone that you expect to take on a role or a responsibility is completely trained on how to do that. And that there are multiple people in your agency, if you've got the size agency that warrants that can take on that task, that you've got an agent, that you've got the ability to move that delegation through to multiple different people, or maybe even a team of people need to take on that decision making or that part of the process. But being very clear about what needs to be done, who's trained to do it, and make sure that they are trained in all of the aspects of it. And then also take into consideration the other things that you're going to be asking them to do to make sure that they're not completely overwhelmed. Maybe take them out of the role of manager and give them that piece of the executive director delegation instead, and make someone else be the manager of that department. Those kind of things are things that your agency needs to think through and be able to write down in the continuity of operations plan. There are, of course, legal things that you need to take into consideration. All right, I would like to give delegation of authority to this person for these tasks, but does the grant that these tasks are under say that no one can sign these papers except the actual executive director? Are there regulations about this piece of our agency's jobs that require some kind of notification, at the very least, that there's a delegation of authority? Does our organization say in the chain of who approves expenditures that there's a contingency for delegation of authority? We never want to put our agency in a place where, after all is said and done, the tasks and the actions that a delegate took on and did now have to be a part of litigation. We never want that to be the case, of course. So it would be prudent to have your legal counsel review your plan and just make sure that it's got another set of eyes on it as it pertains to the legality of the delegation, and that it is at the very least documented in your policies or in your regulations, or available, or a possibility in the relevant laws. It also gives you the confidence and the assurance that when you make that delegation, you're able to do so in good conscience, knowing that you're not putting anyone in jeopardy, or even if they made a decision that caused an unforeseen situation, that they'll not be specifically liable, or they haven't taken that on for themselves. So I keep trying to read the chat, and I apologize, it's distracting. I'll try and turn it off so that I can let my team watch the chat happen and respond to the chat as it happens. Okay. Okay, so we talked a little bit about our organization's policies. We're going to reduce our legal risk by making sure that our policies align, and that at the very least we have written into our policies the flexibility to have some delegation of authority. That's going to increase our operational efficiency. It's going to give us a smoother transition. It's going to make it easier on our staff to know who's in charge, or who they should be turning to in a certain situation. And it's going to make our crisis response faster, because once the management team that has delegated their authority to someone else is freed up, they can then focus on the response, on the disaster response, on going with the inspector and making sure that the building is safe enough, or looking for a new property if need be, or talking with the construction team that's going to rebuild that part of your building that's been destroyed from a disaster. They can take on those kind of tasks, that response and recovery kind of tasks, while the delegation of authority, the day-to-day tasks, can be accomplished by the person that's been appointed that delegation, that authority. I have probably seen, and in fact, if I'd be really honest, participated in the fact that more documents, the minute that you write a document, the next day it becomes out of date. And so, it's difficult to stay on top of these things. And especially when you're in a business that's fast-paced and you have lots to do on a day-to-day basis, and the sky's blue anyway, so who cares about this disaster stuff? And who cares about keeping this stuff new and fresh? And in the interim, the new grant that you just got had new regulations applied to it that now change everything as far as your delegation of authority is concerned. And you didn't take the time to look at those new laws and to adapt that plan and to revise that delegation according to the new regulations or according to the new structure. Maybe you've decided to eliminate a whole department in your downsizing of your agency, or maybe you've split a department into two departments and split the tasks of those folks, and the person that you're doing delegation of authority to for this particular task is no longer the person that's responsible for that kind of work on a day-to-day basis, and so therefore they wouldn't have the knowledge that they used to have. Maybe you have a situation where you just simply have a new structure, a new org chart, or a new management team has come in and changed things up for you. Maybe you've gone under new management, and that new management team needs to be on board with all those delegations of authority. So, checking and updating those plans on a regular basis is going to be a critical part of this whole process, making sure that everything is kept up to date. I know it's a low priority for most of us, but it will be the most important priority when the disaster hits. And you did hear me right. I said when, not if. So, operational readiness. We talked a little bit about training program, about making sure that people are trained to provide the tasks and to smoothly transition into those delegations of authority, and training everyone to know who's in charge and who has which tasks in a disaster when those delegations are made. And then to use that as an opportunity to exercise that, to simulate that, to just have a conversation. You don't necessarily have to get up and take action or take up time that maybe you wouldn't take up otherwise, but you do want to use your day-to-day exercises, your day-to-day operations as an opportunity to simulate what we would do. Maybe you're going about doing your day-to-day task and it's one of those tasks that you would delegate. Maybe you'll want that person that you'll delegate that to do the task, and you observe them doing it so that you can be assured that they have gotten answers to all of the questions that they might have as it pertains to that. And as you go through that process, maybe you can't make all the changes at once. Maybe you don't have the time to create a new plan or to update all of that stuff. Put it in an improvement plan. Put it in an improvement plan and put a time frame on it. By the end of this year, we're going to have these pieces of our continuity of operations plan updated by this person using this method of doing so. And then that person is going to be responsible for updating that plan, for checking off the improvement plan. If you can't get it done, at least write it down so that you know that that's what you have to do in the future. So keeping that stuff going and having an active plan that you can consider a live document at all times and fresh and something that your staff can turn to at any given moment. So we're going to document the delegation of authority. We're going to say so-and-so, this person and that person have the authority to do this task and that task. And we're going to write all that stuff down in our delegation of authority. We're going to write down what their scope is, what their parameters are. We're going to make sure that they have enough empowerment, but that they are still kept within a certain scope, that they know what conditions they would activate that delegation of authority. That's all documented in our document. But then there's another part of it. When that delegation of authority is activated, there's got to be some kind of record keeping that takes place at that time too. So we have to keep track of the actions that person that's been delegated that authority does. And we do that for accountability, and we do that for the sake that potentially after the disaster is over, there could be some kind of an audit, and we need to know who made those decisions, not just the title, but the person that made those decisions, so that we can maybe go back and ask them what was the thought process, or are we missing something, or that sort of thing. So keeping that record of all of the decisions that you made, if you're the one that's been delegated those tasks, is going to be as important as turning to the document that says these are the tasks that I'm supposed to perform. All right, let's get going. We talked a lot about continuity of operations, delegation of authority, but now let's turn to the other element that we're talking about today, or the other primary element that we're talking about today, which is our orders of succession. Orders of succession are predefined lines of authority that pertain to the complete task of an individual, or to a position rather than to an individual task. The purpose of this is, let's say that the executive director is not available for whatever reason, and someone else needs to be the executive director in whole, doing the responding to and recovery from the disaster, as well as the continuity of operations part of it. So maybe we need to pass that whole task, that whole position off to another person. And as we go through this a little bit, I'll show you some examples of what orders of succession might look like. Orders of succession tend to be less temporary, potentially more longer lasting, and more full in that they're taking over the entire position and all of the decisions that are being made by that individual. Again, like delegation of authority, they're not necessarily used, and in fact, probably less used in a disaster situation than they are in a day-to-day situation. And in fact, you probably could find orders of succession for your agency if you look in some of your legal policy and some of your emergency plans or your structure, you'll see that there are contingency plans for upper leadership to pass on the delegation of their the orders of succession, their entire position, if you will. The purpose, of course, is to ensure continuity of leadership. So if the executive director is unavailable, the deputy director takes over, or whatever that looks like. And it also provides some clarity during a crisis for quick decision making. This might not necessarily be something that is handed to another person, but in the unforeseen situation where potentially the executive director is incapacitated or can't get there or can't, has their own issues happening, the deputy or the person that's been delegated that those orders of succession can then take over without being told they have to take over. There could be certain circumstances where you would write into that reasons that succession would take place. Of course, it's used in an emergency situation where there's an assumption of responsibility during a crisis. That might be more short term. They've been good for a whole lot. Hey, short term, that might be more of a short term situation, and then there might be more of a permanent situation or a longer term placement. Say the executive director isn't coming back from Tahiti, they decided to stay. And so, until we've found a new executive director who takes over that job. So it could be any number of reasons why there might be a succession and why someone new might come into play and take over a position. The criteria for orders of succession are, first of all, creating some kind of a plan. Let's decide in advance what positions need some succession, an order of succession. What expertise is available in the agency? Who could take on the whole position of executive director? Could you take on that position? Could the deputy? Hopefully, the deputy, just by title, should have the ability and the power to take on any aspect of a position, but can they take on the whole thing? And then, of course, making sure that there are defined ranks and that we avoid disputes and confusion, and everyone knows who's in charge, who is the one making the decisions at this point. And again, this is not just who's going to be in charge of the volunteers, but it's more of the upper leadership level and the full decision-making powers for the agency. Those successors, just like in delegation of authority, those successors need to be trained and familiar with the essential functions if it's pertaining to continuity of operations planning, which orders of succession I have seen are in regular everyday policy and documents, but they're also mirrored in the continuity of operations plan as it pertains to essential functions and to continuity of operations. So we have a situation where we know that every leadership team needs to have redundancies, and hopefully it's not just a single layer of redundancy. Some examples of succession planning might be if your chief executive officer is the primary leader, then the first successor would be maybe the operations officer, or maybe the vice president of operations, or maybe the regional director, depending on what the structure is of your agency and what the circumstances are. If you have a deputy executive officer, that person might not necessarily be the first successor, because maybe the operations officer has more experience or is more in the weeds on the day-to-day operations, so therefore has more knowledge. I would not say that it's a good idea to base that on an individual personality or an individual's time with the company, but rather by title or by position. And I would say that to be true for all of the things that we're talking about as it pertains to delegation of authority as well as orders of succession. Never put the person's name in your plan that is your executive director or that is your operations officer, but rather put them in by title. And make sure that there are layers of successors. If there is a big earthquake, we might get down to the third or fourth layer of successor before we get to a person who is actually not affected by the earthquake and available to make the decisions that the agency needs to make during a major disaster. So those levels need to be considered. And like I said before, they are probably already written into your policies, and maybe the continuity of operations planning process hasn't been taken into consideration. And so therefore, maybe those orders of succession that are written into your policy are need to be updated. I found with I was working on continuity of operations planning with a city, and I found that that city had orders of succession in their city bylaws, whatever those are called, or ordinance, but it had not taken into consideration the fact that the facilities officer was also the planning section chief in the emergency operations center, and so they could not be in the line of succession to take on the responsibilities of the city manager, or at least we needed to consider when they would take on those responsibilities or when they would take on being the plan section chief in the emergency operations center. When a big disaster happens, there are lots and lots of tasks that need to be accomplished and lots of decisions that need to be made that are not made on a day-to-day basis. And overwhelming people quickly is one of the things that needs to be taken into consideration. And making sure that we didn't give all of the tasks to one or two people who might be completely capable of doing one, but not all of the tasks. So let's talk a little bit about the difference between delegation of authority and orders of succession. As it pertains to the purpose, the delegation of authority is a more temporary decision-making power, just the transition of making these specific decisions. Whereas these orders of succession might be more predefined leadership transition in the absence of whatever leader. So that, maybe the more rounded, higher decision-making process versus the shorter, more transferable decision-making power. I think for me, the biggest difference is the scope. And the scope being that delegation of authority specifically focuses on certain tasks or certain decisions. Approval of resource purchases, approval of overtime, determining whether or not we'll use volunteers in a situation, making sure that payroll gets accomplished. Those tasks that are specifically done by that person that need to be delegated and could be delegated, not necessarily to the next person in line, but to a junior member of the team or another person on the team or someone who actually knows enough about the volunteers that they could take on the task of managing the volunteers or whatever the task is or the decision is. Whereas the orders of succession is more of a full responsibility of a position. The director orders the succession to the successor of all of their responsibilities. That successor might then delegate some of the decision making of that position to other people. The duration of the difference between the two, delegation of authority might be more temporary. It might be, you just have to make these few decisions and then you're done. Whereas the orders of succession might be temporary, but it could be more permanent. It could be more longer lasting. You're not necessarily digging down into the individual tasks, but rather the position and the decisions that need to be made, or the responsibilities that need to be taken on by that full position. What triggers them is sometimes a difference. There might be a difference if, say, for example, that person's unavailable to make that decision or to take on that task in a specific scenario, versus that person is not available to take on any tasks or not available to make any decisions. So, there could be a situation where, the director isn't available at all to make any decisions, or maybe the director is overwhelmed or has too many things to do because of the disaster, that they push tasks off to an individual. So that might be another difference between delegation of authority over orders of succession. The documentation might be a little bit different. You might have a little more flexibility in the delegation of authority, documenting the tasks or the decisions that a person's made, who's been delegated that authority. Certainly there still needs to be that documentation, but it might not be as formal a documentation. It might not actually be a part of the organization's policy as it would be in an orders of succession. Orders of succession, like I said before, typically is found in the organization's policies and not just in the continuity of operations plan. And it's a much more formal passing of the torch rather than just asking someone to take on this task or make these decisions. So an example of a delegation of authority might be the manager delegates the purchasing authority to the purchasing department manager. They're now given the authority to make purchases, but they can't do anything else that the manager does. It also is the manager is delegating. Typically at the manager level, it's a delegation because it's tasks. But at a higher level, like the CEO or the COO, at the top leadership level, it could be orders of succession. And then from there may be delegation of authority for certain tasks. So those two might run hand in hand. They may run completely separate, but you can see where one is more task-based and the other one is more position-based and is more kind of, I take over because the CEO is incapacitated, can't make any decisions, isn't available to do anything, versus I have assigned this decision or this task to an individual. I'm still available as the CEO for other stuff. So those can be a little confusing, but I think that there are some differences, and subtle as they might be, there are some reasons to have both delegation of authority as well as orders of succession in your continuity of operations plan. So now how do we link these all together? How do we get them into our plan? And it might not be as straightforward as you have a chapter in your continuity of operations plan that says delegation of authority, and it speaks to each task and who it's delegated to and what those tasks are. It could be that. It could be that the triggers are written in different places in your plan, that, the elements under the essential functions, there is a place where delegation of authority is written, or there is a place where under the activation of the plan, you can write in delegation of authority could be activated without activating the full plan in certain circumstances. It might be written like that. Most often I have seen a kind of almost a standalone chapter for delegation of authority as well as for orders of succession. If you do have your orders of succession in your organization's policy, then you want to make sure that you have copied those into your continuity of operations plan, and that's a good time to review them and to recognize that they're being written into this continuity of operations plan, and consideration needs to be taken for the fact that there might be some other circumstances for which the orders of succession are used in a disaster that you hadn't considered before. So, it's a good opportunity to refresh that orders of succession as you copy those orders into your continuity of operations plan. Having the clearly stated delegations and orders of succession in your plan are the most important part of this piece. Whether you get them from your organization's policy document or whether you write them specifically for the COOP plan and use them outside of the COOP plan, it doesn't really matter which way that goes. But ensuring, of course, again, that all personnel are aware of their roles and that they have been trained, significantly trained and empowered to actually take on those tasks, and that there is the structure in place, the equipment in place, the access to the software in place, the access to the files in place, that all of those things have been taken into consideration as they pertain to either that delegation or that succession, so that whoever it is that's taking over those delegations and successions can accomplish those tasks in the smoothest way to make it as seamless as possible, either during a disaster or not. Of course, we've talked about this before, but let's say it again, making sure that those things are updated from time to time and that you take a look at, especially if your organization has some kind of major shakeup or major organizational structure change. A lot of times you just don't think about how far reaching those kind of structural changes are. Maybe we've eliminated a department, maybe we've split a department into two pieces, or maybe we've given some of the authority of one department to a different department. When those things take place, you need to take a look at your continuity of operations plan. It's continuity, so let's make sure that we continuously have the most updated information in the COOP plan as well as in our policy. We talked a little bit about legal requirements, about whether a delegation or even a succession comply with federal, state, and local laws, whether they comply with the regulations of your grant or of your funding source or the policies of your organization. Getting your board of supervisors involved in the process, and at least getting them to sign off and recognize that these delegations and these successions are in place, so they too know who is accountable in case someone is not available. But then there's also, making sure that there are ethical considerations taken as well, that we've maintained some transparency and some fairness, that we haven't just given over a delegation or a succession to someone because they've been around a lot longer, or because they have a louder voice, or because they'll be mad if you don't. Those kind of considerations, that the transparency and the reasoning for doing a succession or for doing a delegation are fair, and that everyone has an opportunity to know what that is. And then, of course, making sure that leadership has signed off on, has reviewed, has approved the delegation of and successions, both, that the board of supervisors or your board or whoever it is, whoever your leadership is, that they're aware that there have been these things put in place, and that they're aware when they are updated. That they know that this kind of consideration is taken place when there are updates in the organizational structure as well. There are some challenges, of course. There are always challenges when any of this kind of stuff takes place. I think the biggest challenge for me as I think about it is that there's going to be some resistance. Realistically, there's going to be some resistance to the delegation of authority. There's going to not necessarily be resistance to the succession, but if the succession becomes outdated, that's a challenge. Keeping that stuff up to date is a challenge. Recognizing that the importance of this, when the sky is blue, it's difficult to recognize that disaster planning of any kind is important. It can be put on a back shelf easily when the disaster isn't happening. But when the disaster is happening, it comes to the forefront. And let's hope that we have an up-to-date, clearly designed plan in place that makes that transition and that decision-making process smooth and able to happen and your organization can sustain whatever disaster happens and recover from it as smoothly and as quickly as possible. There are some best practices. The number one thing is practicing. Training people to make sure that everyone knows who's got the delegation, who's on first, who makes the decisions, who should I turn to, whether they're part of that critical human capital management, whether they're part of the essential functions for the continuity of operations plan or not, they need to know. In a situation where we have maybe a big earthquake, let's say, for example, and our organization is shrunk down quickly to accomplish only essential functions, and only the team that does essential functions is still working. The rest of them need to know what to do with themselves, need to know, should I go home, need to know, am I going to get paid, need to know, who do I turn to find out when I should come back to work. Those kind of questions need to be able to be answered, and the staff that isn't part of the essential functions and part of the COOP plan also needs to know what the plan is so that they know how they should respond accordingly. I know during the COVID disaster, and I call it a disaster, many of you call it a disaster, during COVID, many people were, well, everyone was sent home to start with, right? Did they know when to come back? Some people took advantage of that. Some people didn't come back right away. Some people said, oh, gee, I didn't know who was supposed to tell me to come back. Nobody said when I should be coming back or how I should be coming back or if I'm getting paid. HR was inundated with lots and lots of questions because their continuity of operations plan wasn't complete enough to recognize those things and to help everyone to be trained to know exactly what the circumstances were going to be, what the process was going to be when those were the circumstances. So, looking at what the hazards are and practicing what would we do if there was another pandemic, now that we've been through one, is a perfect opportunity for us to practice what will we do different next time, and to make sure that everyone is told next time, you'll go home and you'll be given this information by whoever's in the line of succession to give that information out, or by whoever's been delegated the authority to make those kind of decisions. Another best practice, of course, is to review the plan periodically. I would say annually, or if there was a major shakeup of your organization, that's a perfect time to review your plan and to update that plan. All right. I would like to turn the camera off for just a little while because I would like to get you more involved, and I suspect that you are hesitant to be involved in any big way because there is a camera going, because there is a recording happening, and because that recording will be online. So at this point, for a short period of time, I'm going to turn the recording off so we can have a discussion about a couple of case studies that we've got for you to chat about. All right, so we're going to pause the recording. We can continue our presentation. In conclusion, let's just say, just for the sake of continuity of this recording, we did stop the recording for a period of time, and we did look at two case studies, one of them being World Central Kitchen case study as it pertained to the COVID disaster, and a smaller food provider as it pertained to a flood situation, a weather situation. And so the participants had some interaction with those two case studies that we did take offline so that we could have that discussion, and it wasn't a part of the recording. But in conclusion of this presentation, delegation of authority and orders of succession ensure that there is an uninterruptible continuation of essential functions. And like I said many times, essential functions are the foundation of continuity of operations. Getting those essential functions done during a disaster, no matter what the situation is the reason to have a continuity of operations plan. Doesn't matter the size of your organization, doesn't matter the number of employees or the number of buildings you have or the extent of the work that you do. Every organization has the need in some way to have a continuity of operations plan. Some of the key takeaways are that, of having a delegation of authority and orders of succession in particular, is that those roles and lines of authority ensure that leadership continues, that there is a smooth transition, and that there is an uninterrupted ability to lead whatever the recovery or the response or recovery or continuity plan designates or requires. Having regular training and having updated documents and having clear communication so that everyone knows what the process is and how things work and why or who they need to look to for answers is going to be very vital in your organization's success. Some of the next steps that I would ask of you are that if you have a continuity of operations plan, to pull it out and take a look at it and review at least the sections that we've talked about today, the delegation of authority and the orders of succession. Maybe dig a little layer deeper in your plan and maybe write some of those contingencies that we've talked about today. Some of them being the what if an agency has a delegation of authority, the executive director has delegated some authority to some people, and then the executive director is no longer available, and so the chief operating officer takes over, and that order of succession happens. Circling back and making sure that those delegations are still in place and that they're communicated that there's a new order of succession happening as well. Making sure that everyone is trained to do the jobs that they're being asked to do that are over and above their day-to-day operations, and that they have the tools and the equipment and the access to be able to do that as well. So if we have questions or if we have insight that we'd like to share at this point, I would open it up for anyone to be able to speak, to talk about your experience or to share some examples of what your agency has been through or to ask any kind of questions. I know we had a lot more discussion when we were off camera, so I anticipate that we've answered all your questions and you don't have any more questions and you've already shared all your insight. And I appreciate that and am respectful of the fact that you don't have any questions or any more discussion that you'd like to have. I would just like to thank you all for being here. Thank you for your participation. I really appreciate your involvement in the discussions that we had, in particular as it pertained to the case studies. Also your ability to stick with us through 3+ hours of information, and I hope that we've helped you to take a look at your continuity of operations planning and to consider some of the key elements of delegation of authority and orders of succession. There are other components in this series that you can find on our website at cadresb.org.